Okay, so today I will talk about human-animal relations, gender, and the body in experimental film. The title of this talk is Horsey is Not a Metaphor, which is a direct reference to two films that I will be discussing later with you today. So let me begin with a short introduction. Despite the growing interest in animal studies, particularly in the context of Hollywood cinema and mainstream filmmaking, there are no accounts on how human-animal relations are represented in experimental film or how they link to gender, displacement, and the body. So to fill this gap, I will discuss how the work of contemporary experimental makers echoes the animal and corporeal turn in film studies, consequently questioning the conventionality of gendered expression through references to ecocinema and the materiality of the film medium. So now I would like to explain to you how we understand animal studies, also known as human-animal studies. So in simple terms, it's an interdisciplinary field that explores the ways in which animals intersect or interact with human societies. And one of the first publications that laid the foundations for an understanding of the so-called animal turn or the non-human turn was John Berger's essay, Why Look at Animals, which was originally published in 1977 and then republished as part of his book About Looking, which came out in 1980. So in his essay, Berger examines the evolution of our relationship with animals and how they went from muses or spiritual deities to captive entertainment. And he does that actually mostly in the context of the history of art and philosophy. This and similar publications that came out in the 1970s or 80s clearly challenged the anthropocentrism of the humanities. However, in contrast to such fields as art, philosophy, or literature, cinema and media studies were slow to contribute to critical animal studies, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, mostly because of its strong focus on establishing itself as a serious academic discipline, right? So some of you may be able to recall that back in the 1960s, film studies wasn't really considered to be a serious area of research. And in some higher education institutions in the US in the late 1960s, these were actually students that demanded the field be generated or be taught to some extent, which was pretty extraordinary. So today, obviously, the situation is very much different, and film studies is increasingly engaging with animal studies on different levels. And in doing so, it embraces a variety of different perspectives, including animal rights activism, deconstruction, post-colonial theory, feminist theory, queer theory, animal ethics, and various aspects of the broadly defined post-humanism. Okay, so the fields that are particularly relevant to animal studies are gender and women studies, and that's because both of them actually highlight difference and also how this difference is constructed and represented. So, for example, feminist scholars have addressed the ways in which sexism and speciesism parallel each other, based on the assumption that there are some essential differences between men and women, and also between animals and humans. Animal studies grounded in feminism also addresses the process or the concept of othering, which allows for the assignment of different characteristics to different groups. And these characteristics or these differences are then used to justify the domination of certain categories of people or animals based solely on their supposed nature. Back in the 1990s, feminist and animal rights activist Carol Adams wrote quite extensively on the so-called sex species system. And she defined the system as one that objectifies and sexualizes female and animal bodies that are both marked by their reproductive abilities, especially through meat consumption and pornography. So in other words, we can say that both animal and female bodies can be reduced into meat and then consumed by men, literally and metaphorically. So ultimately, Adams links extreme violence or violence toward animals with violence toward women. So on screen, animals are usually represented as stand-in for humans. And in order to be seen as such, there are given multiple metaphorical significances, which can result in the so-called semantic overload or a metaphorical displacement. And a good example of the latter concept is the experience of suffering that animals supposedly share with humans. Obviously, today we realize that it's not really true, but mainstream cinema bases its representation of animals on such and similar misconceptions. And in doing so, it often allegorizes animals by objectifying, victimizing, or displacing them from their natural context and habitats. This stems from the fact that there is a very fluid boundary between animal and human, and also from numerous parallels that we can draw between animals and women that are both objectified, ridiculed, fragmented, exploited, and ultimately consumed by man. Does it sound too optimistic, right? Does it? Okay, so now I would like to take you on a very brief tour through film history, and I'm going to comment how the representation of animals has evolved since the late 19th century. So it all started more or less with Edward Muybridge's Horse in Motion from 1878. And it was actually a series of photographs or a series of cabinet cards that simply depicted the movement of a horse. This became the first example of the so-called chronophotography, and also an important step for the development of motion pictures, right? This is because both of them, so both early motion pictures and Muybridge's Horse in Motion, were actually based on the idea of creating the illusion of motion. Okay, so since the late 19th century, animals have been featured quite abundantly in movies, TV shows, cartoons, commercials, animated films, and obviously some of these characters were portrayed by animal actors. And as you probably realize, horror films have utilized animals to a great extent, especially the so-called eco-horror film, which is a distinctive subgenre of horror film that features nature run amok for no apparent reason. So, for example, in Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, there is no explanation given whatsoever as why the birds choose to attack the residents of Bodega, California. And it became one of the basic assumptions of this subgenre. The 1950s and 60s saw the release of dozens of Hollywood B movies and independent films which featured animals wreaking havoc on humans. According to most film historians, this could have reflected fears about the nuclear age, since these movies were made in the height of the Cold War era. Meanwhile, in some popular blockbusters from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, animal attacks on humans might have something to do with our fear that we screwed up nature and that nature is now striking back. So this change in approach to animals might be actually related to the rise of environmentalism and the New Age mentality. But it was actually the documentary film, especially some documentary films made in the present century that has changed our ways of seeing animals on screen. So a good example of such a film is the 2001 documentary film Winged Migration, which showcases the migratory patterns of birds. This film was shot in 3 years on all 7 continents. It was also shot using in-flight cameras, and that's why most of the footage that we can see on screen is actually aerial, and the viewer appears to be flying alongside birds of different species, especially Canada geese. So the reason why this film is considered to be so extraordinary is that it offers a sweeping global tour from a bird's eye view. In other words, the third person perspective often shifts the first person perspective, consequently equalizing human with non-human. And obviously today this approach is not really novel, and many contemporary works traditionally associated with ecocinema or ecomedia, such as wildlife films and nature videos, are based exactly on the same assumption. And before I move to my discussion of 3 experimental films, which is really the focus of my talk today, I would like to mention one experimental film, which was one of the first avant-garde films entirely devoted to animals, in this case, cats. And the film that I'm talking about is The Private Life of a Cat. It came out in 1945 as a result of a collaboration between Alexander Hammett and Maya Deren. Maya Deren, for those of you who are not really familiar with her name, was one of the most influential figures in the history of American avant-garde cinema. Alexander Hammett was a brilliant photographer and also her second husband. When they were married, they collaborated on a couple of films, including this one, and also Meshes of the Afternoon, which happens to be one of the most iconic and landmark experimental films of all time. So The Private Life of a Cat is relatively simple in its premise. It depicts the life of Hammett and Deren 2 cats and then 5 kittens in their Greenwich village apartment. It's an intimate study of a female cat and the birth and maturation of her 5 kittens. And what is so special about this film is that it was shot from the cat's eye level, right? So we're dealing here again with a change, with quite a radical change of perspective, especially for the mid-1940s. So the film relies on a series of lingering feline close-ups. It also contains graphic footage of a female cat going into labor and kittens being born seemingly unaided by the human. And obviously, from today's perspective, this image is not graphic at all, but it was considered to be such by the censors who thought it was obscene, and that's the reason why I actually rejected it at the time of its release. So this film presents us with the world, which is totally devoid of humans. It's a cat-only world, right? But on the other hand, it also verges on anthropomorphism, and this is because it actually still offers a voyeuristic viewing experience in which the audience is invited to compare the lives and fears of cats to their own, right? So in other words, the life of a cat is still supposed to bear some resemblance to that of humans. Okay, so let me move to the second part of my talk, in which I discuss in detail 3 experimental films that rely on the animal imagery to a large extent. And so I'm going to discuss Horsey by Frederic Moffet from 2018. A Horse is Not a Metaphor by Barbara Hammer from 2009, and It Matters What by Francisca Duran from 2019. So as you can see, all of these films very contemporary. And we're going to start with Horsey. Now, the entire film is available on Frederic Moffet's official website and also official Vimeo website. So if you're interested, you can just follow this link and see the entire film, because in a couple of minutes, I'm going to show you only a short clip from this film. Before I discuss the film in detail, I would like to introduce you to Frederic Moffet. He's an award-winning media artist. He's actually Canadian, but he lives between Montreal and Chicago. His work, according to the artist himself, explores the slippery territory between lived experience, fantasy, and history. His work is also associated with gay subcultures and sexual performance on screen. The soundtrack for this film was composed by Alex Rosen, and as you will hear, actually the soundtrack happens to be probably one of the most captivating aspects of this film. It originally premiered as an installation at the Sullivan Gallery in September 2018, and it got very positive reviews from critics. It won one of the Best of Fest award at the Onion City Experimental Film Festival. And as told by the artist himself, The film should be read as an allegory recycling images from the past, still relevant to the present moment. And indeed, this is a found footage film, which means that it draws on the footage from other films exclusively. Okay. Now, the films that it relies on are three Hollywood features: The Swimmer, Reflections in a Golden Eye, that both came out in the late 1960s. So they're actually like late Hollywood in transition movies or early American New Wave movies, and The Black Stallion, which is an adventure film from 1979. And Horsey particularly draws on the footage from the first two films, that is The Swimmer and Reflections in a Golden Eye. And it also seeks a lot of inspiration from these movies when it comes to the key themes that these two films explore, including, for example, repressed sexuality, both homosexual and heterosexual, voyeurism, self-deception, the meaning of life, or even murder. So, actually, it's best to interpret this film in light of Reflections in a Golden Eye and The Swimmer, right? So if you're interested in seeing the entire film, I also recommend that you have a look at least of these two Hollywood features. So as I mentioned, the movie was well received by critics. It got some favorable reviews, especially from the jury members of the Anion City Experimental Film and Video Festival. And this is how these jury members actually described the film: a seemingly straightforward exploration of the representation of masculine desire and displacement. Horsey seamlessly weaves together footage from maligned Hollywood productions that banked on the star appeal of their main leads. Moffet constructs a narrative riddled with longing gazes and repressed desires, and the horse come Horsey connects these desires, the repressed caged man, and the symbol of virility, the stallion who has been broken and tamed by society. Masterfully edited, select images weave a new narrative, but the complex sound score, and actually this is one of the things I didn't mention, but the soundtrack is based on the main theme from Reflections in a Golden Eye. And of course, it reworks this theme in a particularly haunting manner, as we will see or hear. So this soundtrack reveals the underlying turmoil, distress, and loss that the images allude to. So now I would like to play to you the first 4 minutes of the film. Enjoy. here because we're running out of time. But it's really one of the most beautiful films I've ever seen, experimental films I've ever seen, especially in terms of its use of the soundtrack and editing. So it becomes clear to us, especially if we interpret this in the context of Reflections and The Swimmer, that the horse, and actually we have 3 different horses, right, featured in this film, becomes a symbol of masculinity with the writer's appropriation of the horse's body as an extension of his own. So we're dealing here with the so-called horse and rider hybrid, which is actually the term I coined myself in reference to another concept of the current driver, which is commonly used in automobilities research. This signals, on the one hand, masculine dominance, and on the other hand, it clearly questions stereotypical masculinity. And stereotypical masculinity in the context of American society and culture of the 1950s or 60s, and this is, or even 40s actually, because this is where both of these films are set. It is all about living American suburban life, governed by strict conventions of propriety and respectability. It's about repressing desires, especially pertaining to homosexuality and queer identity. It's about one's search for validation and approval from women, inhabiting one's normative role, or sustaining the myths of manhood, right? So all of that is clearly challenged here in Horsey. And the horse functions here as a symbol of obsession, passion, self-denial, wantonness, self-indulgence, self-deception, masculine panic, etc. But what's especially important here is that in this film, the horse and the rider become one. And this is not really so frequently, right, encountered in mainstream or Hollywood productions. So let me now move to the second film, A Horse is Not a Metaphor by Barbara Hammer from 2009. In a couple of minutes, I will show you a trailer of this film. And this trailer is available on Barbara Hammer's official website. And this is another film that relies on the animal imagery, particularly it builds on the symbolism of the horse. And before I talk about this film, I would like to say a couple of words about Barbara Hammer. So Barbara Hammer was American feminist film director. She actually died of cancer a couple of years ago. She's known primarily for being one of the pioneers of lesbian film. She created dozens of different films dealing with women's issues such as gender roles, lesbian relationships, aging, and family. And some of her films are kind of explicit, and hence they can be seen as controversial. But at the same time, they broke new ground in terms of their representation of nudity, for example, or lesbian sexual relationships. So this film is a color, black and white film. The soundtrack was composed by Meredith Monk. And again, just like in the case of the previous film, the soundtrack in this film was highly praised by critics. It's an avant-garde essay film. It won second prize at Black Maria Film Festival. And in this film, Hammer depicts her struggle with ovarian cancer. And what she does is that she combines the footage of her undergoing different chemotherapy sessions at the hospital with her visions of horseback riding somewhere in Wyoming, New Mexico, or New York. And at the time she shot this film, she had been for over 2 years in remission from cancer. And despite its rather sad, I would say, or even depressing theme, this film is quite optimistic because it captures the moments of recovery and normality which follow the remission of the disease. It also evokes Maya Deren's methodologies, particularly the concept of vertical filmmaking that Hammer defines as a distinctive approach to filmmaking based on layering of images. And this is exactly what happens here in this film as well. Barbara Hammer superimposes one image over another image so that a series of superimpositions generates different meanings, sometimes contradictory meanings. So the horse here, quite unsurprisingly, I believe, represents freedom, right? As actually, well, most horses do represent freedom in different movies. And also it embodies the flow of expression through movement. According to Hammer herself, the horse is about the power of living in the present to the fullest and with the greatest freedom. So the symbol of the horse became especially important for Barbara during her struggle with cancer, because it reminded her of all the years when she didn't have to struggle with cancer, and when she was free to, to do whatever she wanted, to be creative and to make films. Let me show you the trailer of this film. It's going to last about 3 minutes.
Hammer. Okay, and your date of birth? My date of birth is 5/15/1939.
So for me, this film is just like, both sad and optimistic, really. Purely because of Hammer's use of layering, right? And superimpositions, which relates to the concept of vertical filmmaking. So it becomes clear to us that the horse is supposed to represent the fragility of the female body on the one hand, and not just the female body, it's an aging female body struggling with a disease, right? And on the other hand, it's supposed to embody feminine strength and queer embodiment, mostly through its references to women rodeo riders mastering their stallions. The film also depicts the artist's close relationship with her animals. So not only the horse itself, but also her dog, Spooner. It contains Kurt's dialogue incorporated in lyrical phrases, describing the artist's inner experiences and intercalated with textbook descriptions of the symptoms tormenting her. So one of the key phrases, or one of the key statements actually made in the film For example, I want to be a bird migrating, right? Which also hints at this idea of the freedom of movement and personal freedom. Or horse and I are one, right? Which is especially significant in the context of the entire film, titled "A Horse is Not a Metaphor," right? Which like literally translates the message of this film. So according to the author itself, the horse is not a metaphor in this film, but a living, breathing creature of power and pride that she joins with in moment by moment living, right? So what happens here is this is a very, very we get a similar message than we got in the previous film, right? So in other words, the horse and the rider become one again. They are unified on the representational and physical level. And the last film that I would like to discuss with you is It Matters What by Francisca Duran from 2019. This film screened in several film festivals, but it's available for rent on the Analogica Film Festival website. Analogica was launched in 2011 in Rome, and it's an experimental film festival. Again, I will show you only a short excerpt from the film, but if you're interested, you can go ahead and have a look at the Analogica website where it's available for rent. And before I discuss the film itself, I would like to introduce you to Francisca Duran, who's a Chilean-Canadian experimental media artist. She creates films, video installations, and 2D photo-based mixed media works about memory and violence, right? And this is actually, this film is actually no different. It got the Local Heroes Award at the Toronto Film Festival. It's an experimental animation and found footage film, which reflects on two different things, right? On the representational level, it reflects on the practical and critical human relationships with other than human species. And on the physical level, it reflects on the methods and materials of reproduction and inscription. And it also reworks a fragment from Donna Haraway's essay, Tentacular Thinking, as a poetic manifesto. In her essay, Haraway offers us some of her thoughts on climate change and suggests that we should learn how to coexist with other beings on this damaged planet, right? She also suggests that we should change not only our actions, but also our patterns of thinking in reference to our relationship with the environment. So as I mentioned, a fragment of her essay is interpreted here as a kind of poetic manifesto. And this is done in a very interesting way. There are like several different statements made on the opening passage of the film, and each of these statements starts with the same phrase. It matters what, right? For instance, it matters what stories tell stories. It matters what relations relate relations. It matters what thoughts think thoughts, right? So actually it doesn't really make much sense unless it's coupled with the imagery. And if it is, then it gains this kind of, eco-critical dimension, as you will see. And also this film is very intricate in terms of its use of editing. So it relies on in-camera animation, contact prints, and photograms that are created by the exposure of 16mm film overlaid with plant material and dried for hours in direct sunlight. But the film relies on a very peculiar image. And this is actually the central image of this film, which depicts an owl and a woman proudly holding open the wings of an owl. But the only thing is that this owl is actually dead, right? So the dead animal's head is hanging lifeless below the woman's smiling face. And as I mentioned, this happens to be the central image of this film, which is projected numerous times in the first part of the film. We don't actually know a lot about this image. We know that it's one of those anonymous orphan images, and that it's an archival image from the 1920s or 30s. Once we have a look at this image, it becomes clear to us that it hints at the broader question of human violence over animal species. And the image itself functions here as an ambiguous emblem of human superiority and conquest. It also, I think, challenges a little bit gender roles, right? Because this is the image actually of a woman, right? Who in this case can be associated with some sort of violence toward animals, right? Which is pretty rare again in mainstream or Hollywood movies. And interestingly, this film also features quite abundantly different plants. And plant life here is not only the film's subject matter, but also assists the means of photographic reproduction. So in other words, what happens here is that we are confronted with a material sensory presence of plant matter, which clearly echoes ecological thinking and also allows us to draw certain parallels between animal death, human mortality, and the decay or revival of the film medium, right? Depending on how we look at it or how we interpret it. And what is again quite important, and this is also what happens in the previous films, is that humans, animals, plants, and the celluloid become one, right? They are again unified on the representational and physical level, as this film relates particularly strongly to the materiality of the film medium and the corporeal turn in film studies. Okay, so before I finish my talk, I would like to offer you some of my concluding thoughts on how human-animal relations are represented in experimental film. So in contrast to Hollywood productions or mainstream movies, animals are given more agency in experimental film. So they're not only a subject or a metaphor, but they also become a real object of the film, right? On a more physical material level of the film celluloid. So this forges, after Barker, new models of the human and the animal. In other words, it simply eliminates the classic dualism of human and animal. And a lot of experimental films actually avoid anthropomorphization, especially those that draw on the animal imagery. And they do it in different ways. For example, they undermine the power of the human gaze and invite the reciprocal gaze. Some of them also eliminate the human-animal boundary and equalize human with non-human. And finally, they connect animal species and plant life to the film medium directly, as well as feminine and masculine bodies, desires, and identity, hence linking to gender studies or women's issues, right? So, okay, so this concludes my talk. And I hope that you found it, at least to some extent, interesting. I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. Thanks for being here with us. And have a good rest of the day, and hopefully see you soon.